It is time for Around the 412 with Smitty and Tyler.
Welcome back to another episode of Around the 412. I am Tyler. With me, as always, is my co-host Smitty. Be sure to follow us on all of our social medias at Around the 412. Also, if you're not watching there already, go subscribe to the YouTube channel. We actually have a giveaway going over on X for an autographed Jared Jones jersey. All you have to do is go subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow us on X, and then screenshot a picture that you have subbed to our YouTube channel and let us know in the comments of that post, and you'll be entered for a signed Jared Jones jersey giveaway. So subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and check out the description of the show where you have all the links to our great sponsors. Also follow us everywhere you listen to the podcast, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcast. This is a Steelers episode, and Smitty, it is the final week of the 2024-2025 NFL season. So I figured I just got to open up because the people will want to know, what do you think is going to happen in Super Bowl this week? Who you going for? And also, how do you think it's going to play out?
Everything about this, if you look at the two teams on paper and have watched them play throughout the season, says that Philadelphia should win this game. But like, how do you pick against the Chiefs in this spot? Like, until somebody beats them, I think it goes like, I'd be an idiot not to pick the Chiefs is basically what I'm saying, because they just keep finding ways to win every single week. Their record in one-score games makes the Vikings 2021-2022 season look terrible. So I'm picking Kansas City, even though I think the Eagles are the better team top to bottom.
I agree with you where, like, on paper, you look at the two teams, like how they performed, at least like statistically, not necessarily if you just hide the win and loss column. You just look at the two teams statistically and personnel wise. I think the Eagles should win this game, but it's true. There's something about the Chiefs that if they were going to lose a game like this, they would have lost several games this year already, I feel like. And they've already beaten the team like the Bills, and I thought the Bills were going to make it to the Super Bowl. I thought they were going to beat Kansas City in Kansas City, and I thought that they were going to actually finally go with Josh Allen. Was wrong about that. Was wrong about the Chiefs the entire season, because I along with many others, thought at some point this has to stop. And I foolishly thought it was going to be the Steelers on Christmas Day. That didn't actually happen. But yeah, it's at one point I was like, this has to go on and stop, because the Chiefs just, they don't look that good. But I guess, winning culture is addictive. They just don't know how to lose, and I guess that's a good thing. I wish the Steelers didn't know how to lose as much as the Chiefs do, and as much so like, I'm openly pro Philadelphia, and this is one of the very rare times where I am pro Philadelphia on a Pittsburgh podcast. I never want the city of Philadelphia to actually be happy, because most of those are a lot of those Eagles fans are also Philadelphia Flyers fans. And that's really the only fan base, or as far as teams in Philadelphia I dislike. But I think the Chiefs are going to win. And I think that there's going to be a three-peat. And I think that everything that's come before it, whether you look at the Steelers dynasties, the Cowboys dynasties, the 49ers, the Patriots, like, they'll still be remembered, but the Chiefs are going to three-peat for the first time in NFL history. And I think that that's just going to be anything that anybody is talking about right now. And Patrick Mahomes, I think that he will be deemed, even though he will have less than Tom Brady, I think that people will, like, seriously start to just call him the GOAT if he wins 3 in a row.
Yeah, it certainly changes as he and they do things that haven't been accomplished before. That's where it becomes more of a case for it than just saying he's the more talented of the two players. So certainly the trajectory that he's on, I think that he will surpass Brady at some point. Maybe it is after this game. The other thing that I want to say about it is, I think if the Eagles are going to win this game, it's got to be like 2-score game going into the fourth quarter. Like, I think that if it's close, that's the big thing, is we've seen Kansas City find ways at the end when it's close, even if they've been trailing by a little bit going down to the end. We know that they'll put a drive together to get 3 or get 7 at the end of the game if you let them be within striking distance. So I think the Eagles got to be up 2 possessions in the fourth quarter for me to feel like they're going to win this football game.
I agree with that. I think that if you keep the Chiefs around, they are nasty and they know how to find ways to win. But look at it.
Possibility, by the way, I think that there's a world where the Eagles actually make this pretty ugly. Like one result I don't see is Kansas City blowing out Philadelphia.
I agree with that. Actually, I don't think that's a realistic possibility. But I mean, looking at what Philly was able to do to Washington 2 weeks ago, and putting up 55 on Conference Sunday, I mean that's pretty nuts to do. But also looking, and I know this is completely 2 different teams, but just kind of similar aspect. You look at a team that in Philadelphia several years ago playing the Patriots, they were the lesser team, I would say, between the two. Like more people probably expected, especially with Nick Foles as quarterback, expected Tom Brady and the Patriots to win that game, but they surprised everybody. And so hopefully the Eagles can do that because I've said this several times. I objectively have nothing that I dislike about the Kansas City Chiefs. Like there's not a single thing individually that I dislike about them. I just do not want them to win. I don't want them to be the three-peat, the first team to ever do it. And it's just winning it gets boring, gets stale, gets annoying. I just don't want it to happen.
If it's not your team, you don't want to be witnessing. I mean, at least for me, this is the way that I view it. I know not everybody views it this way, but at least for me, if it's not my team, I don't want to watch history happen. like I know that there's people that like we've had this conversation with baseball too, like watching a no-hitter happen or something like that. Like, I should say if my team's not involved, I don't really care, but I definitely don't want to see it happen against my team. And when it's a team like the Chiefs, like three-peating, why would I care? That people are like, oh, what, you don't want to see history? No. Why would I care about that? Why do I want to watch a team that's not my team do something like this? So this is the first time actually within this run that Kansas City's had where I'm not rooting for Kansas City in the Super Bowl. I wanted them to beat Philly the first time. I wanted them to beat the Niners last year. I wanted them to beat the Niners in their first appearance back in 2019. So that's, or I'm sorry, was it 2020?
I think it was the 19 season. The game was held in 2020.
Gotcha. So yeah, like right before COVID and everything. Yeah, that would have been the last one before it. Because then Tampa Bay beat Kansas City in the Super Bowl default. Yeah. So this is like the first time where I'm not rooting for Kansas City within their run here. So yeah, I hope Philly can get it done. I'm not saying that like there's not a path for it to happen, but I'm not picking against Kansas City. I've done it before and it's burned me. So that's where I'm at with that. Something happened this past week that doesn't necessarily relate to the Steelers, but we're going to make it relate to the Steelers. I mean, it kind of does anyways because it's happening within the division, but we're going to make it relate to the Steelers even more with how we expand upon the conversation. You'll see what I'm talking about in a little bit. But Myles Garrett requesting a trade out of Cleveland, obviously massive, one of the best defensive players in football, argument to be made. He's the best defensive player in football, and he wants out. And it doesn't seem like it's about money because I know people are saying like this is like a play for a contract or anything like that. Man, like for him in his own words to put out a statement, like not speaking through the media, not speaking through his agency. And for the last sentence of this, before he like with that in mind, have requested a trade, the last sentence of like the paragraphs that he wrote, the goal was never to go from Cleveland to Canton. It has always been to compete and win a Super Bowl. I mean, that's pretty damning of the way that he feels about the Cleveland Browns, like feeling like there's no shot that he has a chance to win there. So I don't know how you come back from that. Cleveland doesn't have to trade him. They have 2 more years of his contract, but do they want to go like this could get very ugly. Do they want to go down this path with Myles Garrett, who up to this point has been everything for that franchise, a pillar for that franchise on and off the field? This is super interesting to me. I didn't see this coming. I know that he made the statements, right after the season where he had to sit down and have a conversation about the direction of like that they wanted to go at quarterback and just feel like they were on the same page. Clearly that conversation went very different, went like, I'm not gonna say south during the conversation, but he didn't feel any better about the direction than he did. I didn't think that this much time would have passed if that was the case. I was honestly thinking the other way. I thought maybe whatever happened during that conversation sufficed Myles Garrett and was fully expecting him to get a new deal this offseason.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising. You don't see people of this caliber all that often requesting trades like this, especially in a season where you thought they might get a contract extension from their team. In turn, they wanting to get out. But I think the reasoning is justified for if you're Myles Garrett, because if you go through it, Cleveland's probably their best opportunity to get in Super Bowl contention was like the last year or two of Baker Mayfield before they signed Deshaun Watson. And
the year they beat us in the playoffs, probably. I mean, they're a few plays away from beating the Chiefs.
Playoffs, and then that was a good run by them. But I look at what they did after they signed Deshaun Watson, and that just like hamstrung that team. And then Nick Chubb gets hurt and against the Steelers, actually. And that hurts them. I just think that there is too many bad decisions and bad things that have happened to this franchise really since they brought in Deshaun Watson, where I just think that it is too far gone for them to be a Super Bowl contender anytime soon. And it makes sense if that's his goal to get to a Super Bowl, why you would want to move on. Because when is the last time, and it may never have happened before, but when is the last time a player of that caliber has requested a trade? But also, like, he's the reigning defensive player of the year as of right now. That is something that is an anomaly, if anything. And I just think that it's damning on the Browns organization, which is funny because we're Steeler fans, but the Browns are still the Browns. They make terrible decisions that hamstring their organization, and now it has driven the face of their organization over the better part of a decade away from Cleveland, at least not officially, but he wants out. He wants to go somewhere where they can compete. And to me, that is terrible if you're a Browns fan. But I feel like you have to be able to objectively look at the organization, look at the situation that they're in, and understand why he feels that way. Understand why he feels like he cannot win in Cleveland. Because while you had something changing for a little bit, I feel like they've reverted on all of the changes that they made to progress to that playoff team. And now I just feel like they're back to where they were a few years before that playoff run when they were drafting Baker Mayfield.
I mean, back-to-back first overall picks in Myles Garrett and Baker Mayfield in 2017, 2018. You thought maybe they were going to be the two guys to lead the charge for a long time there, and things have gone the way that they have. But Myles Garrett, game wrecker. I would go as far as saying a game changer. What's going on, everybody? Smitty from Around the 412, and I just want to take a quick second to give a shout out to our folks at Game Changers. Their logo on the screen right now, right above my microphone. Over 2,000 different designs in their catalog. Luxury heavyweight material. I am wearing one of their shirts right now. Best vintage t-shirts in the game. Head over to gamechanger.la or pick6.la to pick up some shirts. And guess what? Use code AT412. Save yourself $10 on your order every single time. Again, gamechanger.la or pick6.la. Best vintage t-shirts in the game. Check them out. The thing that's interesting to me about this, and this is where maybe we can kind of start to segue it into a Steelers conversation, is from the Browns' perspective, like, that's a hard guy to let walk out the door. And I think the argument can always be made, regardless of where you are as a franchise, that you don't move on from those types of players. Like, we're talking about it right now. Now, I understand he hasn't had the team success while there, but it's kind of like how we would never, ever, as Penguin fans, want to entertain the idea of moving on from our core three guys because we want to see them finish, just be one jersey, one sweater guys. The argument could be made that Myles Garrett should never wear another helmet just because of the type of player that he is and how much he has meant to them, good or bad, the team. So I understand that side of it. But if you are looking at it from like a realistic perspective and how far away the team is, they're coming off a 3-win season and how much they need, he's almost given them an out if they want to go that route, because they don't have to be the bad guys in this situation to move on. He requested a trade. So if they trade him for a bunch of draft capital and all of a sudden can kickstart a rebuild, now they got to hit on the picks, but that's giving them the opportunity to move on from Myles Garrett, grant him what he wanted the entire time, so make good with him, and kickstart a rebuild with ample draft picks in a situation where you probably didn't see coming into the offseason. Like, you assumed you were going to go into 2025 with Myles Garrett on your roster, and have to try to compete because you have a guy like that on your roster. But if he's no longer on the roster, it's easier to sell that you are in the very beginning stages of a rebuild. And I don't think that he would have to be the only piece. Like Joe Batonio's talked about, well, maybe he retires depending on what happens with the Myles Garrett situation. Nick Chubb's a free agent. Maybe you look at trading Denzel Ward. If you're going to go all the way in with a rebuild. So he wouldn't be the only piece, I don't think. But with the draft picks that you could get in return, I'm not saying he's like giving you a blessing in disguise here. Because again, you could sell anybody on keeping that player good or bad at any time. But I think that he's giving you an out if you want it to be able to kickstart a rebuild.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the Browns handle it. I mean, obviously, I'm a Steeler fan, so I have some bias against the Browns organization. But I feel like if your player is that adamant that he wants out, and you look at what kind of draft haul you could get from trading a guy like Myles Garrett, I think that you're making a good point where you're not necessarily the bad guy because you're not trading him just for the draft capital. He actually wanted out, and he vocalized that himself. And while you're the bad guy in the sense of you didn't do enough while he was here to get you over that hump and get you to win, you're not the reason that he's necessarily, at least in the immediate, if you look at the grand scheme of things, you are the reason. But like just in the immediate present, you're not the reason why you're trading Myles Garrett, and you could jumpstart and who knows? I mean, maybe one of those draft picks, because I assume you'd get multiple draft picks over several years. Maybe one of those draft picks, if they're early enough, turn into a quarterback. And so when you get out of the Deshaun Watson situation, you could try to rebuild around a different quarterback that you get from a Myles Garrett trade. And if you're trading off these other pieces as well, or you could look at it like a clean slate and a fresh start for the organization. Because if you keep Myles Garrett and you don't accept his request at being traded, I just don't really know what that does for you. You have a clearly unhappy player on your team, and I trust that Myles Garrett will still show up for the season and still play, but I just don't know how that betters you as a franchise if you're keeping the player that so vocally wants out.
I think, but is it a T. Higgins situation where what I mean by that is maybe if he's dealing with any type of injury, he's not playing through it, though. You know what I mean? Like, there's probably certain things that he would do if he was motivated to be there that he wouldn't do if he would rather be somewhere else.
Yeah,
like he's going to protect himself over the team at this point, I think, as opposed to in the past it being the other way around.
Sure.
Yeah. So I don't know. I know that they're saying they're not trading him, but I think as time passes here, it's a trade is going to look more and more palatable for the team. If that conversation starts with 2 firsts, especially because and again, you're probably talking about, it's going to be a good team that wants him, I assume, or that he'll want to go to. And I know that he doesn't necessarily have leverage, but at the same time, if a team knows that he's not going to sign a contract extension with them, would it be a team that even tried to trade for him? So in a way, there kind of is that. Like, I think of Washington, $92 million in cap space right now. No, they have their franchise quarterback. Was that actually spent, their defensive coordinator was in Cleveland not that long ago with Myles Garrett, Joe Witt Jr. So I think that there's some connections there that can make sense. That'd be my number one. I think 3 teams in the NFC North make sense: Lions, Vikings, and Packers. I think about all of them. They're about to play in the Super Bowl, but Philly, I could see them wanting to make that type of splash too. And Howie Roseman's
Philly's defensive line just getting even better.
Yeah, it'd be ridiculous. But I think from that perspective, Cleveland definitely would want to ship him to the NFC. If they're trading him, I find it hard to believe it's going to be anybody in the AFC. People are throwing out like Buffalo or the Chargers. I think that I don't see them trading him in the.
You don't like the Steelers 25-1 odds?
It's wild to me that they have the same odds as the Bucs, because Tampa Bay actually could make sense.
Yeah, that's true. It's wild to me that anybody in the AFC North is higher than literally anybody.
Yeah, they should all be at the bottom, along with the Chiefs.
Specifically, the Steelers and the Ravens. They're tied in the odds. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah. All right, but I said I want to kind of talk about this from a Steelers perspective here and tie it back to us. Obviously, more so than just Myles Garrett plays in the division. But our star pass rusher, TJ Watt, needs a contract extension this summer. And a lot of things that we said about Cleveland. I know that the Steelers are coming off a playoff appearance yet again, 10-win season yet again, but they have a ton of questions about their roster too. And I think the argument could be made they're not that close. Now, close to being a playoff team year in and year out, sure, but from being like a true contender in the AFC, like what's the difference between being a team that's picking in the top 10 or a team that's a first round exit every year from a player's perspective? Like, does that playing that one more game matter that much to a player? I think that there's a conversation to be had about that. So if you're sitting in TJ Watt's position, is there any thought in your mind that he could want to go down a similar path as Myles Garrett, whether it be from actually, let's include both sides of it. Should the Steelers consider going down this path? Or should TJ Watt? And again, this is just should. From a Wood perspective, it's not like we both of us, I think, would agree we don't see this happening. So this is more so just a conversation for fun between two fans, and that I hope a lot of other people in the fan base get involved in.
Yeah, so for this conversation, I kind of have to take off of my fan hat because, like you said, the wood kind of goes along with how I feel as a fan. I don't see it. It's kind of similar to what you talked about with Myles Garrett and relating it to the Penguins' big three with Crosby, Malkin, and Letang. Like I just don't see that relationship ever breaking up. I only see TJ Watt in a Steelers uniform, and I see the Steelers wanting TJ Watt around for his entire career, and I think the feeling is mutual with TJ and the Steelers. However, if you take that off and if you just look at it objectively and go off of should, I think there's a good argument for both sides that they should. Because if you look at it from TJ's perspective, I think that he's been in the league for 8 seasons. And I looked at this morning when I knew we were going to be discussing this, and I wanted to see how long did his brother play, how many seasons that is. And his brother played 12. And his brother played a different position. But I know we haven't talked about it necessarily on this show, but I know you have with Alan on Steelers Afternoon Drive. And we talked about how TJ Watt, maybe he breaks down as a player a little, maybe more drastically than a guy like Myles Garrett would at the same position. And so you figure if JJ played 12 years, TJ has already played 8. How many seasons are we talking about of at least a high level of TJ Watt left? 3 to 4, maybe. I'm thinking that at some point, if you're TJ, you would want to get to the Super Bowl. And if you objectively look at the Steelers and you just take the emotion out of it and look at how they're set up right now, how they're built as a organization to get you to that Super Bowl, we have talked about how far away, like the Steelers are closer to those teams that are picking in the top 10 than they are to the Bills and to the Chiefs right now. And a lot of that has to do with the quarterback position. And I think that there has to be a lot of change in order to get the Steelers closer to the Chiefs and the Bills than it does to have to go backwards. So if TJ looks at that and understands that, I can see why he would want to get out at some point and why he would want to make a trade, because I just don't see the immediate answer in the immediate future, the nearby future, within the next 2 to 3 seasons, how the Steelers are going to get to that Super Bowl contending. And on the flip side of that, you talk about from the Steelers' perspective, who on the team right now is going to get you a better haul than TJ Watt? Who on the team is going to get you the most that is going to be able to turn around potentially some of that immediate future that we're talking about? As much as it sounds backwards, you might kickstart a rebuild and get a head start on that rebuild faster by trading away your best player in TJ Watt than you would by keeping TJ Watt around. And so if you were able to trade him for a first and maybe a first and a third 1 year, and then maybe like a second or third and another year, I wouldn't expect TJ to get 2 first, but maybe that is the case. I think that is something that the Steelers could objectively look at and say, hey, if we're not close to these guys, we're not close to the Chiefs, we're not close to the Bills, how can we get closer? It's that draft capital. It is improving through the draft and in that future. And I think that If you know you're not going to win, trading TJ Watt would make a lot of sense. And again, I say all of this with saying that this is not what I would do. This is not what I would want to do, especially emotionally as a fan. And I don't think the Steelers in any world would do this. But I think that if you strip your fandom away, you strip what you think the Steelers are actually going to do, and you just look at it from an outside perspective of the Steelers to improve the Steelers' future, and also from TJ Watt's perspective of getting a Super Bowl championship, I just think that parting ways is probably more likely to both of those things happening than they are together.
It's one thing I just want to say, not related to TJ Watt, but we were just talking about Myles Garrett and the other piece of Browns that can move. As we were recording, Denzel Ward is at Radio Row for the Super Bowl. He told, I don't know if it was Mary Kay herself or just a group of people, that if the Browns trade Myles Garrett, he'd start to question if he wants to be there.
I mean, I'm sure you'd have several people feeling that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to see what the domino effect would be if that first one does fall with Myles Garrett being traded. But as it pertains to TJ, I mean, I share a lot of the same sentiments as you. The one thing that I'll say from like my perspective, and also I wonder how the team is looking at the end of this past season. Like, if you told me TJ wasn't playing the last month of the season, I would have believed you. And I don't know how much of that was just related to like in-season injury, but at the same time, like everybody's dealing with injuries at that point in the year. We've seen him produce despite injury or playing through stuff in the past, and he's not getting any younger. Like, as much as it sucks to say, we've seen probably the best version of TJ Watt that we're going to see. I don't believe we're going to see him eclipse 22.5 sacks like he did just a couple.
Oh, you mean the NFL sack record? I think you're right.
So I'd like to think that we've probably seen the best version of TJ Watt, unfortunately. I just wonder if we're already starting to see the downswing. Like, I don't know how to wait the last month of this season. Is that more indicative of just something that needed to heal and he'll be better back to himself next season? Or are we starting to see that, decline already? Because like you said, Alan and I've had this conversation. He's not like a physical freak, like compared to the average person. Yes. But compared to the Myles Garretts and other players in the NFLs of the world, that's not why he is as good as he has been throughout his career. So I don't know. I really don't know how to wait what the end of TJ Watt's 2024-2025 season looked like. And I think that there's got to be a little bit of question about that. And it's just now he's in a contract year. So I don't know. From the Steelers side, they're not going to entertain the idea of trading him. I fully expect him to sign an extension. But like, if I was again taking off my fan cap here for a second and looking from the outside in, I could see why people think that they should entertain a TJ Watt trade. Because I think it makes sense for all parties. Like, and from his side, why wouldn't he, if he had the opportunity to go to, I don't know, a Detroit, play opposite of Aiden Hutchinson on the other side of him, if TJ's willing to move around, or if Aiden Hutchinson's willing to move to the other side, or go back to Wisconsin and play for the Packers, like he probably should have during the 2017 draft when they decided to take Kevin King instead of TJ Watt. I think that there's a lot of different possibilities that probably aren't going to come to fruition because I don't see them trading TJ Watt. I don't want them to trade TJ Watt, but I think it's a conversation worth having because it makes sense if you think about it from both sides.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that will probably go on the rest of his career. But another thing I wanted to add in talking about this, and you were talking about the health of TJ Watt, have we seen the best of him? I feel like a good argument against that, at least for the end of this season going into next season, is looking at his teammate also on that defensive line, what we talked about with Cam Hayward a lot this past offseason, and looking at what he did in 2024. Nobody thought that Cam was going to eclipse the play that he had in 2024, and yet he did, and he looked better as a 35-year-old than he did as like a 32-year-old. And I think that there's some merit to that. And I think that that's a good argument, at least against for what we're saying. And I agree with you where I think there is somewhat of a question mark in not just have we seen the best days, because I feel like the NFL sack total or sack record, like, yeah, we've probably seen the best days of TJ Watt, but like just being that high level caliber, like 15 plus sacks a year, like can he eclipse that again? I'd like to think that yes, he can. But like Cam Hayward had to do, he's going to have to go out and show it. It's one of those things where I think that the conversation will probably be had for the rest of his career. It's almost like relating to another Pittsburgh, and we've referenced him, but like just individually, like referencing whether like the Penguins should trade Crosby. That's a conversation that has been had for the last several years. And I guess if you take looking at from the outside looking in, it makes total sense to people. But it's just something that's never going to happen. I feel similarly about TJ Watt and the Steelers.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Cam thing, because there was certainly some question about how he would rebound this year. I had questions about him, and he's older than TJ Watt, so
and you were giving him a
fair
contract
point to make. Yeah. So that's certainly a fair point to make. We'll see how things play out for TJ. Fully expect him to remain in a Pittsburgh Steelers uniform. Let's switch gears here and talk about something. You brought up something that I thought was interesting, and I decided to expand upon it. He threw this my way earlier, talking about, team needs and whether we should address them in free agency or the draft. I said, let's each come up with what we believe are the 5 biggest needs on the team, and then say whether we feel like they should address them in free agency or the draft. The first one that comes to mind, I don't know if you put this on your list, because obviously quarterback is a need right now. It's just Skylar Thompson on the roster. I put quarterback on here, but for me, that's free agency.
But I added an asterisk because that's just a given.
Yeah, it's free agency, but it's Justin Fields, who was on the roster last year, coming back and playing this year. I mean, like a best case scenario in terms of 2025. And I don't even know that I would want them to do this, because while I think these two players at this point in their careers are better than Russ, it's the same idea. And I just don't think that this team's good enough to just drop in a vet quarterback and say that they're going to be a contender. But like, if the Rams were going to trade Matthew Stafford, if the Seahawks were going to trade Geno Smith, would that move the needle for the Steelers? Probably a little bit, but like, it doesn't take them from, an 8-win team to a Super Bowl contender. It takes them from, with Justin Fields, like a 8 to 10 win team, probably, to 11, 12 win team that maybe wins a playoff game. Like, that's how I would view those two moves. So for me, I have quarterback on here as one of their top 5 needs, obviously, with only Thompson on the roster. But I expect that box to be checked before free agency starts, when they re-sign Justin Fields.
Yeah, I think that Justin Fields is the obvious answer, and I will add that I think that a quarterback gets added through this draft. I just don't think it's going to be early, like some people may expect. I don't think it's going to be a Jackson Dart. Or I guess the 2 people that I would look at, you'd probably get in on day 3 as of right now, are Curtis Rourke out of Indiana, and then Tyler. What's his last? How do you pronounce it? Shuck?
Tyler Shuck.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it was Show or Shuck. So Tyler Shuck out of Louisville. Those are the 2 that I would be interested in.
Was Justin Herbert's backup. Like, that's how long he's been in college football. The only thing with him is honestly his age. But like, man, I'll be honest. I think there's some benefit to that, because you're not talking about a guy that you expected to be a franchise quarterback, step in and lead your team for a decade plus as the starting guy. But so if you're talking about a guy that's just like you're taking to be your backup quarterback, and you feel like maybe there's something there, does age really matter that much for those guys? And I think that there's something to be said about a guy that's played in like 4 or 5 different offensive systems. Like, he's probably seen everything that you could possibly see. So I think that he's certainly an intriguing guy. To be honest, I wasn't expecting you to say Rourke. I thought you were going to go like Will Howard's going to be gone before that point anyway, but I thought you might say Kyle McCord.
I saved that from you. I didn't want to say that while I was on a video call with you. I know that might be a touchy relationship with the Ohio State sort of thing. I mean,
we went on to win a national championship immediately after he was gone, so I feel like they were vindicated.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like that is why I shouldn't even say his name.
But I mean, there's some
great
intrigue
year at
there.
Syracuse. Great year at
Yeah.
Syracuse. I mean,
Other
another
than
one that I
Pickett.
feel like has been people have talked about potentially the Steelers drafting is like Dylan Gabriel. I wouldn't want that personally, but
No,
I
no.
think the thing that you want me to be honest, the thing that I like about Shuck and that I like about Rourke is that they're 6'5", 220 plus. Like I just like their size. I like their build, and I think that that's something that maybe like you mentioned, they're not going to be your starter. They're not going to be your immediate franchise savior. But as someone that could be like potentially your backup in 2025, that it could be like a project to mold around and see how that turns out. I don't mind it.
Yeah, Tyler Shuck's going to turn 26 in like week 3 of next season. Like, if he wasn't that old, I feel like he has a pretty good case for QB3 in this class behind the obvious top 2. I still have Will Howard above him, but he might end up being my QB4. Probably says more about the draft class than it does his talent, but I think there's something there with him. All right, so we have quarterback on there. I had that at number 5 just because it's obviously the most important position, but it's like when you talk about the options that are out there, just the assumption that Justin Fields is going to be back, I put it down at 5. You said you had an asterisk by it, but where'd you have it in terms of?
So in terms of like the grand schemes of the team, I had it at 1, but that's why I had it as an asterisk on it because
Okay,
it is the most important need. I just don't think that that's something that we really need to discuss as far as like other team needs. Though it's just too obvious.
Yeah. All right. At number 4 for me, I have running back in this spot, and I'll be honest, these are all going to be pretty close. I feel like, but I put running back at 4 just because they do have Jalen Warren, who I think is a talented player on the roster. They obviously need to add something more there. In terms of where I would do that to me is a draft, like easy draft spot. I think there's like 30 plus running backs in this draft class that are going to get drafted. There's a ton of guys that make sense specifically for the Steelers, whether you're talking about Devin Neal out of Kansas, Byshal Tootin, I'm a huge fan of as well, and I think might be out of Virginia Tech, might be the best fit specifically for Arthur Smith. Ran a ton of outside zone there. The offensive system very similar to what Arthur Smith likes to do here. I know Steelers fans will love it. They get him the ball a ton on like sweeps and pitches and stuff like that. So they probably get pretty frustrated watching the way that he's used. But honestly, like this is how this offense should be run, and this is the back that you should have when you're doing these types of things. But it's such a good class in general, and not even just at the top with Genty and Hampton and Johnson, but you get into day 2 with guys like the Ohio State guys, Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. I mentioned Devin Neal. Khalil Mullins is a good player. Taj Brooks out of Texas Tech is a good player. Damian Martinez out of Miami. I mentioned Byshal Tootin. I don't love this fit because to me, this is adding Najee Harris again. Ollie Gordon out of Oklahoma State. I think he added like 12 pounds last year before the college football season. I don't think it'd be a bad pick, but it's just like we're just going down the same route here. Like this is another running back that I don't really think fits the offense. But yeah, for me, this is easy draft.
Yeah, me too. And you pretty much mentioned everybody that I would be looking at in this draft. I mean, the Ohio State running backs. I think if the Steelers are going to draft a running back early, I think that's where it could happen. I mean, my pick between the two, and we've said this before, would be Quinshon Judkins. But if they would with Travion Henderson, I wouldn't be complaining either way. I think I like both of those guys. You mentioned Devin Neal. I actually like him a lot. I also, and maybe it's just because I watched a lot of Big 12 this year, I don't mind DJ Giddens as well, another Kansas. So Devin Neal's Kansas, but Kansas State, DJ Giddens, I don't mind him as well. And then I wrote down, so I had running back at 3, by the way,
Okay.
on my team needs list, just because you have Jalen Warren, who is actually technically a free agent, if you want to look at RFA as well.
Yeah.
But I just think that you look at the running back position and just the offense in general, there's just so many offensive needs. And I feel like the needs of this team revolve mostly around offensive personnel. And then you look at not only replacing Najee Harris, but like, what are they going to do with Cordell Patterson? If they walk away from him, they're going to have to be replacing 2 guys. So I think that definitely one is going to come from the draft. You may see the other in free agency. I mean, there's a whole slew of free agent running backs that they could decide between. It'll be interesting to see how teams approach free agency with some of the running backs coming into free agency this year, looking at what guys like Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley did this season. So it'll be interesting to see how those teams approach it. But I think that the draft is the easy spot to pick a running back, and I would expect the Steelers to at the earliest start looking at one at day 2 in like round 2 or 3, but I think that you're not going to see one any later than round 4. In my opinion, you're going to see in those middle rounds a running back's going to be taken, just because I don't think you can rely that heavily on a not necessarily a non-guarantee, but just a bigger question mark if you're waiting until like 5 through 7 to draft somebody that's probably going to be getting some considerable playing time, considering right now you only have Jaylen Warren.
Yeah, absolutely. So my number 3 is cornerback. I look at
Okay, so we
that
flip
room.
3 and 4.
Yeah. Okay. So I looked at that room right now. Feel good about Joey Porter Jr. Like, I know was probably from what we expected, probably took a little bit of a step back in his sophomore season as opposed to what it looked like he was going to be as a rookie, but I'm still very encouraged by him. And I think that he's going down the right path. So feel good about him. On the opposite side, though, and behind him, like, I know there's been talk of bringing Dante Jackson back. We've already had that conversation. I don't know that I'm super interested in that, because even if you're talking about it from like a depth perspective, I don't want to bury a guy that's talented like Corey Trice on the roster. They certainly need to add somebody to that room still, whether it's going to be Dante Jackson or not. Let me throw a name at you that was thrown my way. Was it last night or 2 nights ago? That I was told the Steelers really like Asante Samuel Jr., set to hit free agency. He fits the mold of what they liked in that he's only 25 years old, but he's a 4-year guy. Like, he's been in the league already 4 years, has the NFL bloodlines. It's basically the corner version of Patrick Queen and them going down that same path again. I think they're going to be all over him in free agency. I think they're going to have a ton of competition for his services as well. Good player. But yeah, he was thrown my way. And the reason I like it so much is because in 2 corner looks, he can be on the field with Joey Porter Jr. When you go to 3, he's a guy that can kick inside, and then you can have Corey Trice as the other outside corner opposite of Joey Porter Jr. So I think he'd be a perfect fit. It's not a position that I would shy away from double dipping. I think they could add one in the draft too, but this is one where I look at free agency first, just because you got guys like him, you got Charvarius Ward, you got DJ Reed, Carlton Davis. I think it's a pretty decent corner free agent class, as opposed to some years. But for me, that list starts with Asante Samuel Jr. just because of the versatility.
Yeah, I think the Steelers would definitely value that, considering some of the play that they got at nickel quarter. Like, they're definitely going to be
they wanted Cam
on
Sutton to be the inside-outside versatility guy.
That's why I was going to say they're definitely going to be relying a lot on Beanie Bishop to start 2025. We'll see what they do to shore up that position group as well. But I feel like Asante Samuel Jr. makes a ton of sense for the Steelers. He's one of the better free agents in this class that I would say. And I will say that I like you, have corner being addressed mostly as a free agent signing. And I think that if you're looking for an upgrade at Dante Jackson, I think that you're going to sign one of these free agents. And whether it is like Charvarius Ward, Carlton Davis. I mean, I know Carlton Davis and Charvarius Ward, a little bit older players, but I still think that would be slight upgrades over what you were getting from Dante Jackson. I still think that they bring a lot of good with them. Byron Murphy's another free agent that would come to mind to be one of those outside corners. Doesn't necessarily bring the versatility that like Asante Samuel Jr. would, but someone that they could bring in for that outside. But I think Asante Samuel Jr., that's a good shout. He makes a lot of sense for the versatility. And I'll say, as far as double dipping goes, if they do bring in one of those guys in free agent, the guy that I would look to bring in this draft is Kobe Bryant out of Kansas. I think you can get him in like the 4th round. I like him a lot. He lit up my dude Parker Kingston at BYU whenever BYU played there in 2023. I think he's a really good player. He's a really aggressive player. I think that's something the Steelers are going to value. He's someone that I would look in like the 3rd to 4th round area where the Steelers might keep their eye on him.
Yeah, I actually posted a clip about him. Like, I was just starting to get into like my draft stuff, and Nick Faribaugh sent me a text, and it just said, "There's another Kobe Bryant in this draft class. I need you to look at him." and I looked up his name, and that was the first clip that I saw, and I was like, "Oh my god!" Like, yeah, this just seems like a guy that the Steelers are going to fall in love with. A lot of people are probably going to fall in love with him. But like some other guys, Jody Barron out of Texas is going to be an interesting one to watch. Siobhan Revel, who was linked to the team towards ACL this year, so didn't play out of Eastern, or where's he from? ECU.
ECU sounds
East
right.
Carolina. Yeah. Ben Morrison out of Notre Dame mentioned a lot too. Trey Amos, Ole Miss guy, and then Azariah Thomas, the corner out of Florida State, who is coached by Pat Surtain. which I know the team will love that about him. Absolutely lit it up at the Senior Bowl. One of my favorite corners in this class. I think he's being undervalued. I don't know if he'll be there for them in the second round. He's kind of in that weird spot because if they took him at 21, a lot of people might look at it as a reach, but I don't think that he's going to be there at 52 if they wanted to go that route. So that's going to be a tough one to find the sweet spot for him, but some good shouts there, some good names. My number 2 is defensive tackle, defensive line in general. I think they need a bigger bodied guy to go there. I'm kind of expecting at this point Larry Ogunjobi to be cut. I think they'll kick out Keanu Benton to take that spot. They need pieces on that defensive line, and I think only heightened by the fact they gave up 300 yards rushing against their division rival Baltimore Ravens in the playoff game, I think is really going to speed up that process if it already didn't. Like, I think that they hope that the side of fixing the offensive side of the trenches is done now. Hopefully, those guys just get better with time. And that's really the only thing that they need is the reps, and they have the talent. Time will tell on that. Now they got to start working on the defensive side of the trenches because Keanu Benton is really the only long-term piece that they have there. We'll see how much Cam Hayward has left in the tank, what a year that he had, maybe bought them some time in terms of adding to this defensive line group. But I think it's super important to start adding pieces to that now. And I'll be honest, this is draft for me as well. I looked at this defensive line group. I mentioned there's 30 some running backs that could get drafted. I mean, this defensive line group could see 4 or 5 guys go in the first round. They could see 20 plus, 20, 25 get drafted. Such a good group. I think the Steelers will dip into it, had their attention a ton at the Senior Bowl. If there was one group that they were watching more than any other, it was that group. So I think they want to add to it through the draft. So I'm at number 2 for that.
So I am actually at number 2 as well with that one. I think that that's something that we have talked about on Around the 412 for what seems like forever, or at least it feels like forever, but really probably since the 2022 season. Whenever we get to draft talk, we always talk about the defensive tackles being a sneaky need for the Steelers, just because we've always looked at the future of the position. And I feel like more now than ever, despite having Cam Hayward have the bounce back year that he did have, you still have to be preparing for the future without Cam Hayward. And I think that Larry Ogunjobi is going to be cut this season like you. And so I do think that that's going to come from the draft. I think that is very plentiful at the defensive tackle position this year. And then if you were paying attention at all to what was going on with the Steelers and the Senior Bowl, more specifically Mike Tomlin, I mean, we know he loves defensive guys and watching those guys, but apparently he had his eyes all over the defensive line at the Senior Bowl as well. I think that comes from the draft. And I think, like you, that could, for the Steelers, if you tell me that they're going to take a defensive tackle in round 1, I think that's very believable. And there's a couple guys in there that I would love the Steelers to take from that position group. But there's guys in the second and third, fourth rounds that I really like in this draft. And I think that they could make a lot of sense for the Steelers. And this is a draft where if I'm picking just a player type, I'm picking big and tall. That is the defensive tackle that I'm looking for, kind of to be a gap filler for the Steelers. I think they need to get better in run defense. You look at the Steelers in some of the games these past couple of seasons, they've kind of gotten gashed a little bit. I don't think they need a defensive lineman to get to the quarterback necessarily. I think that they need somebody to be that stonewall in the center of that defense. And so there's several guys that I look at that could
sound like you just described Deion Walker out of Kentucky.
I mean, Deion Walker out of Kentucky is a massive man. But I mean, even if you want to go in later rounds, and when I say later rounds, I mean the third round with Omar Norton-Lott out of Tennessee or Alfred Collins out of Texas. There's several guys that kind of fit that same mold that I would look at and say that in the first, second, third round, I think defensive tackle makes a ton of sense for the Steelers, not just because of them looking at it at the Senior Bowl and that being a focus, but just looking at the need for the position and the future of that position. You don't want Keanu Benton to be the only guy that you have as a future piece moving forward. And so that's why it makes a ton of sense. And we have it at number 2, but not only do we have it at number 2, but it's definitely one of the more talked about positions of need for the Steelers this offseason.
Walter Nolan, Kenneth Grant, Derek Harmon put on some weight last season at Oregon, Tyleek Williams, TJ Sanders, who they got a good look at. I
I
mentioned
mean,
Deion
realistically, the
Walker.
only one that we probably shouldn't even mention is Mason Graham because he's going to be gone at that point. Everybody else is up for debate on whether the Steelers are going to take him.
Yeah, because I think the number 2 D tackle probably is Walter Nolan, and maybe he goes in the teens, but there's probably a case that he could get there. Like anybody that says like a slam dunk, this player is going to be gone. How many times do we see those guys slide? Like, so who knows? Who knows the way things are going to play out? But yeah, there's some really good names to keep an eye on there. Which leaves number 1 for me, wide receiver, and this has been ignored for a while for the Steelers, and this is a double dip position for me. So I don't even need to say free agency or draft because I'm probably adding 1 in both because I'm also expecting George Pickens to not be on the roster, and I don't think that you can get by just through the draft if that's going to be the case. You're going to need to bring in some type of vet. It's going to be interesting to see like what route they go. I know that they like Chris Godwin. Obviously, we've talked about them being players in the T. Higgins market, whether they can land him or not. That's a different conversation. I know Amari Cooper's name has been thrown out there. Whether you have interest in or not in that, I'm not sure. We've mentioned Darius Slayton. I know that they were interested in trading for him last season. So now that he is going to hit free agency, certainly he can make sense. To be honest, it's not a great free agent group. Like guys are older, coming off injuries, both. Like, so it's not great there, but they need to add some type of vet. And then we get to the draft. And honestly, compared to like years past, relatively weak at the position, in my opinion. I think if you look at like guys that are in the top 10 of this class, they'd have a hard time cracking the top 10 in most years. I mean, there's guys that I like, but the problem is too, like 2 of the top, I don't know, 10 at least prospects are guys that just cannot fit within what the Steelers are trying to do anyway. Actually, 3, I would say the top 10. Like, do they have any interest in like a Luther Burden or an Isaiah Bond or a Xavier Restrepo, being that they already have Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson? Like, I feel like they can't covet that type of player. You need a bigger body type of guy, or at least somebody that's, Emeka Buka is not huge, 6'1", 205. He can hold his own. He's very good blocking. That's the receiver that we've talked about a ton. But like Trey Harris, 6'3", 210, I think he would make a ton of sense as like a George Pickens replacement. He's a little bit I'm sorry. I think he's a little bit, he needs more work to be ready to go. I'm not sure that he's just like a drop in and have him be super productive right away. I know Matthew Golden's been a popular name amongst Steelers fans and in mock drafts. I really like Jaden Higgins, who had a nice Senior Bowl at Iowa State. The name that I haven't talked about a lot yet, this is one of the only receivers that I've really dug into so far. I know it's early in the process, but I'm going to have a hard time keeping Jalen Royals out of my top 5 receivers in this class. Utah State guy, so, you probably don't love to hear that. But I think this dude, unbelievable at the catch point, super raw athleticism, runs like a 4.38. So it can run anything on like a vertical path. I don't like second and third level. The route tree really expands for him. I'm not sure how much work he would do underneath, but hopefully that's where Roman Wilson in year 2 comes into play. So yeah, like if they were to add somebody in free agency and then not get a receiver day 1, but take like a Jalen Royals or Higgins on day 2, I'd feel pretty good about. If you're not getting T Higgins, maybe you Jaden Higgins.
There you go. Like you, so I had quarterback as my 1 asterisk, and then wide receiver is my 1-1, my real 1, because it is a huge need. I feel like that's so obvious for anybody that watched the Steelers in 2024. And I think that they are going to double dip in both free agency, draft, and can I include trade in there? Like, because of the whole Cooper Kupp situation.
Yeah.
If the Steelers draft Cooper or made a trade for Cooper Kupp, I know that's not free agent, but I would at least say that's a realistic possibility that may happen outside of a draft pick. And so I think that the Steelers are definitely going to add at least 2 receivers. And I think that that's going to come from outside of the draft, whether that be the trade for someone like Cooper Kupp or a free agent and somebody in the draft. You mentioned guys in the draft that you like. Jalen Royals is someone that I actually like as well. Familiar with him just because he does play at Utah State. Kind of familiar with the Utah players because of my BYU fandom. And that's somebody that if the Steelers were waiting to take a wide receiver, and instead of taking one really early. I think that makes sense. I just think a lot of what the Steelers are going to do for the wide receiver position in the draft is going to be answered prior to the draft actually happening. At least I hope so. I hope that it's answered because they've already either signed a free agent or made a trade for Cooper Kupp. I hope we don't get into a situation like we did last year where that answer is not necessarily happening until the draft, and it's not going to be answered until after the draft, because I feel like if that answer has happened about as far as like who it is, whether that is Cooper Kupp in a trade or whether that is a free agent, it's not going to be T. Higgins. But it's somebody. I feel like where you draft your receiver in the draft is going to be answered prior to that. Now, if it's somebody where drafting an Emeka Egbuka in the first round still makes sense, then I think that is something that could happen. And while that doesn't necessarily say that they wouldn't double dip as far as, like, say they trade for Cooper Kupp and then take one in the first round, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I definitely think that shifts their draft needs a little bit. And you could probably say the likelihood of them taking one that early is going to be downshifted because of a trade that would have happened. So some guys, you had mentioned some guys. I'll add a couple names to that. Who had a great Senior Bowl this week is the MVP, Jack Beck out of TCU. I think that's somebody that could be a solid draft pick later on if the Steelers are not going to be taking one super early. And another school, I know Steeler fans aren't necessarily going to want to hear the school, out of Maryland, Ty Felton is somebody that I think that is a raw player but could be molded into a solid wide receiver in the NFL. And that's really what I look at from this wide receiver draft class, is that it's got some raw skill. It's got some raw talent. I just don't think a lot of it is high end as previous draft classes. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take some development from some of these guys in the NFL. Like, I don't think there's a ton of people outside of the top few that are going to come in and be a team's wide receiver too. On a team. I think that you're looking at a ton of guys who are similar to like what the Steelers took in Roman Wilson. Unfortunately, Roman Wilson didn't even see the field last year for the Steelers, but I think that there's some developmental guys that you're taking, but they're not necessarily going to be a quote unquote George Pickens replacement or somebody that's going to be higher up on your depth chart immediately in a Steelers uniform. That's why I think double dipping makes sense, whether that is going to be free agency or a trade for someone like Cooper Kupp, which is why I know we're going to be wrapping up, but I wanted to ask you, like, do you think that a trade for Cooper Kupp, because we haven't talked about it, do you think it makes sense?
No. I'm not saying, like, if they made it, I would be like, okay, like I talked myself into being okay with it. I wouldn't do it. It's similar to like how I'm viewing the quarterback thing. He's 32 years old right now, set to make $20 million. Now they could pay that down if the Rams are willing to take on his signing bonus for this year. Maybe he's making 12.5 or whatever. And then, the following year, not guaranteed. They can maybe do something with that. But he's not a guy that stayed on the field a ton as of late. Like, he's been good outside of 2021, but that's the year that everybody looks at when he won the Triple Crown. And I'm just not sure that, like, what he is right now is just like, this target hog, basically Deontay Johnson in his time with Ben Roethlisberger is the type of player I think you're talking about now with Cooper Kupp is really what this team needs. Like, if I could be talked into the idea of George Pickens being on this roster in 2025 and there was like no question about it, maybe even beyond that, maybe George Pickens just like an innocent angel from this point on. You give him an extension, $120 million, and he's good to go for the rest of his career. I think Cooper Kupp could then be a nice like number 2 guy to drop in, but I just worry that that would be checking the box at the top of their depth chart if they go and get Cooper Kupp. And I don't view him that way, and I don't think the roster's set up to be able to make sense to drop a guy in like that. Now, what I will say is, if he were to, I have to work something in here, so this is why I'm going this route. If they were to not trade him, but instead go the path of a cut, could make sense. Smitty from around the 412 here, and while I may not have much hair, the hair that I do have will not be cut by anybody besides Keek at Keek's Barbershop. My friend Christian Circle, been with us since day one. Keek's Barbershop, located 401 Burkitch Way, Suite 2 in Beaver, PA. Download the app The Cut Book an appointment with Christian today, or you can do walk-in with Tony or Ashley. But again, Keeks Barbershop, 401 Burkitch Way, Suite 2 in Beaver, PA. Go check them out. Old school vibe in there. Absolutely love it. Cannot recommend them enough. Wouldn't go anywhere else. Maybe I'll see you there. Because you're not talking about the draft capital, and I don't know, like, in the money would be, not $12.5 million or whatever it's going to end up being via trade. But yeah, I'm not as on board as what I've seen a lot of Steelers fans be with him. I'd rather sign Chris Godwin in free agency.
I'm actually on board with that too. I would rather sign Chris Godwin in free agency. I'd rather sign Darius Slayton in free agency and then get somebody else in the draft. I think the Steelers, they've got options at wide receiver to be experimental with what they do between free agency and the draft. And there's several players they could look at. I just think that it's clearly that wide receiver is going to be a huge emphasis this offseason. I did want to mention, before we wrap up, I did have an honorable mention as well. And then I specifically talked about one guy in this honorable mention just because you'd be taking them from a divisional rival. And I feel like the Steelers have honestly a knack for that. We've had several people come to the Steelers that have played at divisional rivals, but also as a position of need, so to speak. I have offensive tackle as an honorable mention. I know that they drafted Troy Fautanu and they have Broderick Jones as their starters, but I feel like having a guy to be a backup and having a guy that has versatility to play multiple positions as well is something the Steelers like. Patrick McCarry is one that I would look for the Steelers to sign in free agency. I think I would like that a lot because he can play guard, he can play tackle. And it's something that I think the Steelers wouldn't mind and would make sense for them.
Yeah, that's not bad. I mean, if we're talking about like positions to keep in mind, I think guard is one to keep in mind. I don't think Mason McCormick was so good that he needs to be handed the right starting right guard spot next year. And tight end, I would keep in mind as well. I don't think that anybody outside of Pat Freiermuth or Darnell Washington within that room should have a job handed to them either. So I think they could use another pass catching tight end. You mentioned taken from a rival. I almost like to go the tight end route and say Mike Gesicki as a second pass catching tight end because he's set to be a free agent. He's like the only, he's just a pass. He's basically another receiver. So like if you're just talking about playing 12 personnel, lining up him in the slot, something like that, I think that there's a case to be made that they need a second pass catching tight end is what I'm getting at. But you didn't go that route, so
no. A little much too Penn State in that room for me.
That's true. That's true. All right, before we get out of here, got to mention one more sponsor, Marcello Electric, our friend Boots, Brandon Marcello, electrical outfit that provides services to Beaver, Allegheny, Lawrence. I'm reading off his Facebook page right now. So by the way, that's something that he put in here. Anyways, Beaver, Allegheny, Lawrence, and Butler County, residential, commercial, service calls, whatever you need, feel free to reach out to him via email, which is on his Facebook page. We got the link down below. Or you can just reach him directly, 724-614-0611. Again, that's 724-614-0611. Marcello Electric. Hit up our boy if you need any work done. Again, that's in the description of the show. Link to that his Facebook page, as well as everything custom designs. Although, shout out to Haley, about to have a baby. So I believe that she's taken off for a little bit. Understandable. But still message her, get on the list for when she starts resuming to take orders. You can get your shorts around the 412 shorts, DC4L Customs. Be sure to go over there and get those if you want them. Again, GameChanger.la, Pick6LA, or .la, not Pick6LA, Pick6.la to save yourself $10. Use code AT412 at checkout. Bunch of Steelers designs. We mentioned Myles Garrett on here. They have a Myles Garrett design, but if you're watching or listening to this, assume that you don't want one of those. And if you're a Browns fan and you're listening to this for whatever reason, probably don't want one of those right now either until you see how things are going to play out. But that's it. Be sure to subscribe, like, hit that notification bell, tell a friend to tell a friend, hit us up in the comments with a question or topic, how you feel about anything that we talked about. We want your top 5 positions of need and how you feel like the Steelers should fulfill those as well. Follow us on everything at Around the 412. Hit us up on listening platforms as well, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. You'll find us there. Just search Around the 412. For Tyler, for Smitty, this has been the Around the 412 Steelers show. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.